a little earlier, giving us an update of all that's happened over the last 2 days. Back to you.
Sharanjit Lail there for us in Christchurch with all of our live coverage on those mosque terror attacks. And of course, we saw a lengthy news conference from the New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. You heard a lot of those points that were being made, Sharanjit Lail, just giving us a lot of detail about what she had to say, and she reiterated over a number of times that there is this provisional list of the missing that has been released because of a request from the families, but that list is not exhaustive. It's not a formal list, and so it won't be released publicly at this time. Now, one of the other very interesting points that Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister, mentioned was about Facebook, Google. She was asked whether they ought to be regulated, and she said she tried as much as possible to get a lot of that footage of the attack taken off platforms. And she also said that the Chief Operating Officer, Sheryl Sandberg, from Facebook has reached out to the Prime Minister, obviously, to share condolences. And she said that she intended to talk to Facebook about this problem of a lot of this material on social media. Well, in the last hour, Facebook has actually tweeted about that New Zealand terror attack. And it's reported that in the first 24 hours, it removed 1.5 million videos of the attack globally, of which over 1.2 million were blocked at the point of upload, and has also posted that out of respect for the people affected by the tragedy and the concerns of local authorities, it's also removing all edited versions of the video that don't show graphic content. This issue of this kind of content on social media and how far-right extremist groups connect on social media is something that's really been talked about, especially since this attack. Well, Greg Barton is a counter-terrorism expert at Deakin University in Melbourne, and I asked him if the methods used to track Islamic State extremists could also be used to track violent members of the far right.
Absolutely, they can. I mean, we're not dealing with different mechanisms of radicalisation or even vastly different ideas. These things are more similar than you would imagine. The problem, though, is that most terror attacks in recent years, including we've seen a lot of far-right attacks in the Northern Hemisphere, but attacks from Islamic State as well, have been mostly lone actor attacks. That's a single individual or a small group of people working outside of a network communication situation. So those Al-Qaeda attacks of last decade we're not seeing again, thanks to good intelligence. But the flip side is we're seeing the lone actor attacks, and that's the real challenge. Not so much that it's right-wing extremism. The challenge is that it's people who previously weren't really considered a priority, and we haven't had the resources to keep under surveillance.
Much has been made about the role of social media in this. People have been talking about certain forums where people post a lot of extremist, far-right extremist views. Can more be done to try and find those people on social media, or is it an impossible task?
Well, more can and needs to be done, but there are two separate things here. One is to try and reduce the amount of extremist material that's online, including standard sites like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. The second is to pay attention to people who are simply just posting stuff and talking big, to people who are changing behaviour in a way that indicates they're going to move towards violent action. And that's the harder thing to do.
You talk about the social media organisations. Does there need to be legislation? I mean, what needs to happen for social media organisations to take some of this material seriously?
Well, they are taking it seriously. They put a lot of resources into this, but it's still, you know, your question about legislation, it does appear that we can't rely upon social media companies by themselves to sufficiently prioritise what needs to be done. There will need to be some force placed upon them. The algorithms that go down news feeds on social media platforms drive us increasingly more edgy material. That creates, not by design, but by accident, a fertile environment for more and more extremist material to come up.
Greg Barton there. He was a counter-terror expert at Deakin University in Melbourne. Well, one of the other things that's being talked about is gun control, a revision of gun policy. That's what the New Zealand Prime Minister has been saying. She says that she's going to talk to her cabinet about it in the first instance on Monday. Well, Philip Alpers is a founding director of gunpolicy.org, run by the Sydney School of Public Health, and it looks at gun law policy around the world. Now, I asked him how New Zealand could change its gun laws.
It would be very easy, but whether they have the political will or not to do it, we have yet to see. I'm a New Zealander. I feel very, very strongly for what's been going on here, especially seeing your coverage. And what I can say is that it would not be possible for this Australian to have done this in his own country. The question now is whether he came to New Zealand for his to do this, largely because he knew that it was a soft touch for gun laws. New Zealand does have some good gun laws, but there are large gaps, and it's those gaps that allowed this tragedy to happen.
It must be very difficult for you as a New Zealander to watch what's happened. I wonder, you say this couldn't happen in Australia. What are the specific gun laws in Australia that are different to New Zealand that would stop this kind of mass attack?
After the Port Arthur massacre in Tasmania, where 35 people died, and the newly elected Conservative Prime Minister, John Howard, took 12 days to wrangle all 9 jurisdictions in Australia, the states and territories, into agreeing to uniform gun control laws right over the country, very stringent. And they also bought back and destroyed all the semi-automatic firearms, centrefire firearms they could find in the country, and 1 million guns were destroyed in the end. That's about 30% of the stock of guns in Australia. If you did the same thing in the United States, it would be 90 million guns. So it was a huge effort, and the most important part of that, probably in the long term, was the registration of firearms right across Australia. Now, New Zealand is almost alone with the United States and Canada in not having, in not registering 94% of its firearms. It was that large gap in the law that facilitated this crime.
But just briefly, would registration necessarily stop someone from still using those guns to commit such a horrible act?
Not the guns that are already in the community, but it would stop this person or other people being supplied with guns on the grey market, as they call it. At the moment, you can sell semi-automatic firearms in a pub car park in New Zealand with no requirement to keep documentation, no requirement to declare who you've sold that firearm to. The police don't know where the guns are, who's got them, how many there are in the country, because there is no register of firearms.
It was Philip Alpers there, founding director of gunpolicy.org, run by the Sydney School of Public Health, talking about those issues there. Now let's just remind you now of what's been happening this last hour. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has confirmed that another person has been taken into custody as part of the investigation into the attack on 2 mosques in Christchurch. But she did say officers believe the person who is being questioned was not believed to be part of the attack, but was what she called tangential to the investigation. Now, she also confirmed that her cabinet would be asked to consider changes to gun laws in the next 24 hours, and she also talked about a provisional list of the missing to families. But let's also show you some of the earlier pictures of the Prime Minister. She met people at the Islamic Centre of Kilbarnie Mosque and comforted a lot of the community there who have really been hit by this tragedy. Do stay with us here on BBC News.